Good morning. Today I am going to talk about the physician reviewer's role in the pre-market safety review of generic drugs. So what are the goals of this presentation? Firstly, we want to review expedited safety reporting requirements for bioavailability and bioequivalence studies for generic drugs. Secondly, we are going to describe the steps in pre-market review and the medical officer's or physician reviewer's role. Next, we will share some of the most common errors we have observed with the submission of SAE reports to FDA, and we will provide advice for a more efficient and effective review process. Our group is called the Clinical Safety and Surveillance Staff, or the CSSS. It is in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research in the Office of Generic Drugs and located within the immediate office. We are a multidisciplinary team composed of a clinical team, data team, drug safety coordinator, and director who oversees our group. We are responsible for a range of activities from pre-market to post-market safety. So what does the CSSS do? We oversee generic drug safety and surveillance. We also participate in center and office activities and coordinate with other offices on generic safety issues. We investigate reports of adverse events and of perceived therapeutic inequivalence of generic drugs. We evaluate and act on potential emerging safety signals, and we will inform various CDER decision makers and external stakeholders. I'm going to start off with the pre-market regulations. So what are the pre-market reporting requirements for generic drugs? Title 21 Code of Federal Regulations Part 320-31D3 describe the requirements sponsors have for reporting pre-market SAEs for generics for bioavailability and bioequivalence IND exempt studies. Sponsors are required to notify FDA of SAEs and all participating investigators no later than 15 calendar days after becoming aware of its occurrence. In the case of death or life-threatening SAEs, sponsors must submit an SAE no later than 7 calendar days. These pre-market SAEs must be submitted to FDA on a MedWatch form, FDA Form 3500A, and the current procedure is that these reports are to be emailed to the OGD pre-market mailbox. We are presently working on creating an option for direct electronic submission, and we hope it will be available in the future. It is important to note that all SAEs must be reported regardless of causality to FDA and to all participating investigators. This includes SAEs with the test, the reference-listed drug, placebo, or at any time during the study. A common question we receive is, should all SAEs for bioequivalence studies be reported, even when the person conducting the study does not think the events are drug-related? The answer is yes. FDA expects to receive all SAEs for bioequivalence studies in the investigational and approved drug group, regardless of whether the event is considered to be drug-related. Any follow-up information received by the sponsor must be submitted to FDA no later than 15 days after receiving the information. These reporting requirements apply only to IND-exempt studies that are conducted in the United States. Studies conducted abroad, outside the United States, are not required to submit SAEs, but if they want to, they can, and we will review foreign SAEs if received them. Sponsors sometimes send them to us, but they are not required to. Adverse event information from foreign studies is included in the ANDA submission. There's published FDA guidance available online for industry and investigators to help sponsors comply with safety reporting requirements. I have actually listed this guidance on the resource slide at the end. Bioequivalence study requirements are mostly on pages 25 to 27. So what is the physician's role in reviewing pre-market SAE reports, and why have physicians review these reports? Medical training enables expedited and targeted review of SAEs and gives us the ability to comprehend the relevance of the clinical events. A physician is assigned to an SAE, and a medical doctor will review each individual report in detail. A single physician initially evaluates it, and multiple physicians may be involved in the review process as necessary. A physician will often examine reports in the scientific literature and perform literature searches to actively seek new safety information about the drug under investigation. The physician or medical officer reviewing the SAE may need to request more information in order to adequately evaluate the SAE properly. If FDA does request additional information, then this should be addressed and submitted no later than in 15 days. The physician assesses pre-market SAEs and also determines the safety and conduct of the study, assesses whether we are conducting the study in the appropriate population, and determines whether there is any causal relationship between the study drug and the SAE, as well as conducts a risk analysis. Over the years of reviewing these SAEs, there are some concerns as physicians we have observed and can share with you. One of our concerns is, are we enrolling the most appropriate group of subjects into the study, and what inclusion and exclusion criteria are being used? We want to assure we exclude subjects that may be at risk when a drug is studied. Therefore, appropriate enrollment criteria is important. We have observed variation in the quality of bioequivalence study enrollment criteria and the application of those criteria in studies. Next, questions have been raised when reviewing reports whether there is adequate clinical monitoring taking place of individual subjects. I will talk more about this on the next slide, but variation in the quality of bioequivalence study safety monitoring has been noted, as well as the varied applications of standards of care, monitoring, and management of subjects during studies. Lateness of reports. We have had issues with sponsors not reporting the SAEs within the appropriate regulatory time frame. Missing information in the SAE reports. This is one of the most common reasons resulting in information requests. We understand due to the time frame that you may not have all the information available. However, if that is the case, please inform us in the MedWatch. Let us know what steps you have taken, what information has been requested, and what information you are waiting on. There's product-specific guidance published by the FDA on many drugs. The bioequivalence recommendations include information to assure you are studying the most appropriate study population and using the appropriate study dose for the drug. We want to work together with you to ensure we do have the most appropriate population, for example, whether the drug should be studied in healthy volunteers or in patients, and whether this dose is appropriate. So we are always open to dialogue. And just to circle back to the subject of clinical monitoring, the safety of subjects in these clinical trials for us is of utmost importance. We want subjects to be adequately monitored in generic clinical studies. Despite seemingly adequately designed studies, we sometimes have concerns. This includes the inconsistent quality of the bioequivalence study protocol and safety monitoring execution. During the study, is there a medically responsible person in charge who carefully reviews the results obtained of all of the assessments performed on each of the subjects. It is important to also confirm that each subject continues to meet all the inclusion and exclusion criteria throughout the study. And finally, we want to make sure that if an SAE occurs, we want to assure the subject receives appropriate medical care and is adequately followed to the resolution of the event. So how do we submit better submissions? It is helpful to submit with your MedWatch form the full protocol with the inclusionary and exclusionary criteria. Submit an up-to-date detailed study protocol rather than a protocol summary with each pre-market SAE. The protocol is necessary to correctly interpret the reported SAE, and the full protocol is the most common information request. Also, include the case report form as it is helpful for the reviewer. Include hospital records and discharge summary if available. For deaths, report the status of the autopsy and include the autopsy report and death certificate if available. Unblinded study drug treatment that was administered to the subject. Sharing this helps the reviewer properly interpret the SAE and to know whether the subject received the reference listed drug, the generic, or placebo. Make sure you include key study dates and events, such as when screening occurred, when the subject was enrolled, and when the drug was given. These are all important in relation to the SAE and its occurrence. Timely review of the safety information is critical to ensure the safety of subjects. Make sure you have systems in place between the sponsor and investigator to ensure timely submission of SAEs. If delayed, include an explanation in your submission and how this will be fixed in the future. Now, I just want to illustrate an example of a real-life SAE we received. In this particular case, the highest dose of a long-acting central nervous system stimulant was administered. This was indicated for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and this was in an 18-year-old female with an unremarkable medical history in a study for healthy volunteers. Screening electrocardiogram was judged not clinically significant with just marked sinus arrhythmia. A single dose of medication was given in fasting, and during baseline, pulse and blood pressure were normal. However, at 6, 8, and 12 hours after the administration of the drug, there was an increase in heart rate and slight elevation of blood pressure. Based on the warnings for cardiovascular reactions and sudden death, the drug may have contributed to the persistent increase in pulse rates and blood pressure. Unfortunately, this subject was found dead on day 6 after receiving a dose and while participating in the study. We looked for other causes of death, such as drug overdose or any other apparent reason. Drug and alcohol tests were negative. Nothing was found on the toxicological studies, and there was no clear cause of death listed on the autopsy report. Concerns remain, and we had many internal discussions. Did this subject have an unknown cardiac structural or conduction abnormality? Could she have experienced a sudden arrhythmia or had an undiagnosed heart issue? Was the screening and medical history performed thorough enough? Should the subject be more closely monitored with increases in pulse and blood pressure or allowed to go home without follow-up? Based on such situations, we recommend careful screening and taking the time for a detailed medical history when selecting subjects for your clinical study. Now we have a challenge question based on the material presented. Within how many days of becoming aware of a fatal SAE must it be reported to the FDA? Is it 15 days, 30 days, 7 days, or 10 days? The answer is C, 7 days. You must report a death within 7 calendar days to the FDA. And our second and final challenge question, which of the following statements is not true? A, sponsors do not need to submit an SAE if it is unrelated in the opinion of the investigator. B, sponsors must notify FDA of pre-market SAEs conducted in bioequivalence studies in the United States only. C, sponsors conducting bioequivalence studies outside the United States are not required to report pre-market 7 and 15-day expedited reports to FDA. Or D, follow-up information requests from FDA must be submitted within 15 days, and sponsors must submit additional information as it becomes available. The answer is A. It is not true. Sponsors do need to submit an SAE regardless of causality and the opinion of the investigator. So, in summary, industry has the responsibility to submit SAEs in a timely manner according to the regulations. Please submit pre-market SAEs with as many details and information as possible for the FDA physician to review, and protect subjects in generic drug studies by careful selection, adequate subject monitoring, and follow-up. And on this side, we have a couple of resources for reference. Thank you.
These times. My name's Edward Kemp, and to help introduce the topic of this presentation on post-marketing pharmacovigilance data analysis, I'd like to start with a poll question to the audience. Now, this is an optional poll question in an online pre-recorded webcast, and it may be relatively uncommon, and thanks in advance for your patience and participation. Please know that there's no right answer to this poll question, and responses using the anonymous poll feature on the screen may be available. Okay, so before pausing for responses, I'll read the question. Have you or someone you've known experienced a side effect or adverse event while taking any medication in the past 2 years? And the response options are no, yes, yes and completed a MedWatch form, or no vote. And I'll pause here for about 10 seconds or longer if there are any instructions from the good folks running the online poll feature for the opportunity to see other responses by entering your own response or simply making a note of your answer on your own. Okay, thanks for your participation, and what better way to introduce a talk about data than to have data to talk about. And I can promise no results from this poll will show up in a journal article named something like personally identifiable adverse event experiences among industry leaders. But what can be revealing is the response yes and completed a MedWatch form, which leads us into this talk's objectives. First, what this talk won't focus on is why we need post-market pharmacovigilance for generic drugs, a topic for an entire talk itself, for example, one that could involve complex issues of allowable differences in generic drugs, understanding differences in quality and user interfaces, and differences in what happens to a drug on its way up to a patient. These topics are likely to be focused on in other talks, if not already. For the purposes of this talk, we'll consider generic drug post-market pharmacovigilance using MedWatch data, for example, to highlight examples of what data are considered when doing post-market surveillance. When, in terms of timeframes, can the data be revealing, for example, short-term and long-term trend analysis, where challenges can crop up when analyzing generic drug safety data and for passive surveillance data in general. and how we can move forward generic drug post-market pharmacovigilance to help ensure safe and effective affordable drugs are made available to the public. So we mentioned a little bit about MedWatch. Let's point out a few quick items about it. As many know, MedWatch is FDA's Medical Product Safety Reporting Program, which receives reports from the public and, when appropriate, publishes safety alerts for FDA-regulated products such as prescription medicines. There is an online reporting portal for health professionals, patients, and consumers, and the Form FDA 3500 for voluntary reporting is also accessible through the link provided. There's also a mandatory reporting element for IND reporters, manufacturers, distributors, importers, user facility personnel. The authorizing statutory requirements regarding drugs have been codified under 21 CFR 310 and 314. And of course, if you'd like to find out more about FDA's Safety Information and Adverse Event Reporting Program, I provided a link on the slide. Okay, so from our poll at the beginning of the presentation, a story now emerges around how increasing that number of, quote, completed a MedWatch form, unquote, poll response individually can provide valuable safety information collectively. Let's take a moment to visualize a common viewpoint around surveillance data. So many have likened viewing safety information in the population to viewing an iceberg. For information about an adverse event, medication error, or product problem to be seen, it must pass through several steps, including being reported by patients, healthcare professionals, and others. And arguably, if one step, for example, occurring after the administration of an approved product from population prevalence to report and beyond, does not occur, the greater the likelihood the safety information remains below the surface. Here, the moment you and I take that step to report a drug safety problem to MedWatch, whether it's through individually or through a healthcare provider, is the moment you and I participate in revealing a tip of the drug safety problem iceberg. And with timely collective data on post-market experiences, we take another important step towards revealing the iceberg. More of it is revealed using other data sources such as real-world data on generic drug products and how they're used, prescribed, and dispensed every day. And it becomes clearer how these elements, among others, lend insight into clinically important medical product safety alerts. Delving a bit deeper, we can characterize potential drug safety signals, for example, through reports or contacts from the public directly to FDA, whether through email, phone, or other methods of contact. Potential signals can be identified also through collaboration with other Center for Drug Evaluation and Research offices, such as Office of New Drugs, Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, and Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'd like to take us through an example of how the CSS currently uses data from Drug Quality Reporting System, otherwise known as DQRS, which is a subset of MedWatch reports related to quality or an equivalence. Largely, they're spontaneous reports. These are nearly 1,000 MedWatch reports per month on average, and these are searchable across multiple fields with dynamic reporting. Specifically, for example, the data team looks at temporal patterns in DQRS data, whether it's long-term on a yearly basis or short-term on a monthly basis, to visualize patterns of complaint types and lend information to regulatory decision-making. Here, viewing the proportion of total defects on the y-axis across reporting periods here on the x-axis can demonstrate an established baseline of complaints like generic substitution questions shown here in blue. If we observe significant increases or changes in any given category, we can investigate further and use data trends to help inform decisions going forward. We also leverage data sources to analyze and inform viewpoints into patient experiences and utilization. Following on with this example, we used trends in DQRS complaints over time compared with IQVIA market share data. And for simplicity here, we can view this concept as reported cases in blue and product market share in orange. This first graph is of relatively low level of concern. The frequency of complaints for this hypothetical product decreases while its market share stays relatively level over time. And in order of increasing concern for the second graph, it demonstrates both complaints and market share increasing, where the concern would be based more on additional factors like types of complaints and complaint narratives. Here, for example, we can turn to plausibility assessments and observe how individual complaints contribute to the severity of a generic drug safety problem. And finally, the third scenario shows higher levels of concern when comparing these three hypotheticals. Here, complaints for a product increases despite relative decreases in its market share. And with all other variables being equal, the case for regulatory decision-making in this scenario becomes clearer. We do well to remember the imagery of viewing a tip of an iceberg, that is, seeing only a portion of complete safety information when we interpret potential drug safety signals. And we can juxtapose some universally accepted potential limitations with surveillance data with the following. Namely, some reports do not identify a specific generic drug product. This can lead to issues of underreporting cases where we would need relative risks to be very high to detect adverse events. Similarly, some complaints for generic products are misattributed to brand and vice versa. So you can start to see how the data may not be fully representative of an entire population. And stimulated reporting, for example, when we see an increase in complaints about a drug after voluntary recall or another event or an announcement, and stimulated reporting can impact a drug safety profile definition over time. With a whole list of challenges to adverse event reporting, such as difficulty in identifying brand versus generic, or the challenge of identifying incomplete reports, to the inability to verify or test the reliability of sources for some patient reports. This data does provide us with a unique window into patient narratives that helps us understand the nature of the problem at the patient use level. Okay, so we can see more of why increasing the number of completed MedWatch form poll response that we took earlier is only part of the picture. Literature around surveillance systems demonstrate that improvements at the level of individual case reports is not only quantitative, meaning the more reports the better, it's also qualitative. Reports have to be complete, relevant, and contain necessary information. Therefore, this leads us to enhancements. And CSSS is engaged in development of new data systems like FDA's Adverse Event Reporting System, FAERS-2. These systems offer up improvements to generic drug signal detection, enhanced generic drug data management, and offers up new generic drug analytical methods. One important item to note is that FAERS data is accessible by the public. In these following links here on the slide, folks can access FAERS dashboard, which is an interactive web database tool, and also FAERS data files for raw data. It's also important to know that MedWatch is continuously improving, where steps are being taken to increase prominence and clarity of items such as manufacturing information. Here, OGD is also engaged in improvements related to form revisions and electronic reporting. Okay, remember the poll response that we took earlier? It's not only appropriate to increase that number of completed a MedWatch form poll response, but steps are being taken to help ensure that the quality information improves along with the quantity. In the interest of time, I'll only list additional enhancement efforts, some with content-rich links, and I urge folks to find out more, if not already. I'd like to end on a note about proactive monitoring and areas of exploratory data analysis where we can use data sources such as generic drug complaints and medication use errors to help us early detect issues at the patient-user interface. To illustrate, let's return to the relationship between reported adverse event and market share. At its surface, we examine these data together starting at one point and see that, for example, they both begin to converge at a more current point. With previously collected data points, observed experiences with related or similar drugs, and other variables such as seasonal trends or departures from known effects related to peak adverse event reporting after regulatory approval and sources of bias, we can monitor for unusual trends and apply low-level extrapolation given an adequate number of data points and other conditions to derive thresholds for signal detection across groups of drugs and identify patterns of abnormality given past observations to conduct or at minimum flag for exploratory analysis. If we accept existing statistical monitoring evidence that suggests adverse events must be extraordinarily unusual for passive reporting systems to detect them, we can sort of peer below the surface and take a proactive approach, ranging from conducting comparative analysis, looking across classes of products and drug risk profiles, incorporating known trends across collections of data sources, and drawing insight and support from scientific discussions and what we know about the history or the life cycle of a drug, product, or class, for example. Meanwhile, leveraging analytical methods on novel data sources to help derive a truer risk-benefit safety profile for a generic drug product. These are all topics worthy of future talks. But to sum up here, OGD places a high level priority on enhancing generic pharmacovigilance and has a high value on the potential of continuing improvements. CSSS looks to apply improvements to big picture items, for example, where data can demonstrate that generic drugs have similar, if not the same, safety profile as brand drugs, or when it supports information submissions to get, quote, submissions right the first time. In many cases, improving the use of current data sources and enhancing methods and the application of new data sources and models can reveal a better picture of each safety-related iceberg we encounter. Thanks. There are a pair of continuing education challenge questions. First, who can submit adverse events or medication errors to FDA MedWatch? Is it A, health professionals, B, patient and consumers, C, industry, or D, all above? And the answer is D, all above. Second, what FAERS data is available to the public? Is it A, FAERS dashboard, B, FAERS dashboard and data files, C, formally requested data only, or D, data is not publicly available? And the answer is B, FAERS dashboard and data files. Thank you to the folks who helped put this presentation together and for the support in advancing post-market pharmacovigilance data analysis and decision making. Feel free to contact me at edward.kim@fda.hhs.gov. That's Edward, EDWARD, .KIM at fda.hhs.gov. And I would be happy to respond on the team's behalf. Thank you so very much for your time and attention.
Good morning. I'm Debbie Catterson, the lead clinical safety coordinator for the clinical safety surveillance staff in the Office of Generic Drugs, and I'm going to speak to you today about some of the emerging trends in post-marketing safety surveillance for generic drugs. After this presentation, hopefully you will be able to explain the importance of generic drug surveillance, list examples of potential quality issues for generic drug products, and illustrate with real-life examples that I will share with you of some quality issues that have been evaluated by the Office of Generic Drugs. And lastly, identify emerging trends in generic drug surveillance. So why do we even need post-marketing surveillance for generic drug products? Well, we know that generic drugs are evaluated to ensure that they are therapeutically equivalent to brand name drugs. That means that generics must be pharmaceutically equivalent and must demonstrate bioequivalence in a statistically supportable manner. But on occasion, issues can arise due to allowable differences between the brand and generic, and we need to monitor for those issues so we can address them. And drug products are just getting more and more complex. We have complex formulations, such as liposomes, emulsions, and gels, complex dosage forms, such as long-acting injectables, transdermals, and metered-dose inhalers, and complex drug-device combinations, just to name a few. And these complex drug products have unique quality and reliability issues. So I mentioned that there are allowable differences between the generic and the brand product. So what are some of those differences? Generic drugs can differ in shape, scoring configuration, release mechanisms, packaging, excipients or inactive ingredients, expiration time, and container closure systems. As an example, the green and orange capsules in the photo on the right are the brand name Prozac or fluoxetine. Below that photo, you see 4 different generic versions of fluoxetine, and you'll notice that they all look very different from Prozac. But over time, the public has come to expect their generic capsules and tablets to look different, but be just as safe and effective as brand name drugs, and they appreciate the cost savings. But sometimes these allowable differences can cause problems, and they may result in complaints from the public about the quality of the generic product. And here are some examples of the type of generic drug quality complaints that we've received from patients. Tablets breaking apart, scored tablets breaking unevenly or crumbling when split, tablets sticking in the throat, unusual odor, taste, smell, or texture, precipitates in oral liquids and injectables, patches not sticking, container closure issues, eye drop safety seals falling off, and injector malfunctions and needle breaks. And sometimes these quality issues can result in a potential safety issue for the public. And I will share some real-life examples of that shortly. So it's important for the Office of Generic Drugs clinical safety surveillance staff to monitor these post-marketing complaints and conduct regular surveillance so that we can identify potential safety issues and address them. So where do these potential safety issues and quality complaints come from? Well, they come to us from different sources. We have our CSSS Data Team Pharmacovigilance Report. Now, this is the post-marketing surveillance work that Ed Kim just spoke to you about, and that's done by the CSSS Data Team. We also receive MedWatch reports and other complaints from other CDER offices. Another source is the internet and media. And we may receive them directly from patients and physicians by email, mail, and telephone. As the safety coordinator, I'm the primary contact for the CSSS. So all of these complaints and potential safety issues are forwarded directly to me. So what do I do with them? Well, I bring them to the CSSS Safety and Surveillance Committee. This committee is a multidisciplinary group of physicians, chemists, and scientists from the Office of Generic Drugs, the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, and other CDER offices as needed. At this committee meeting, the results of the CSSS Pharmacovigilance Activity Report is presented and evaluated by the group. Again, this is the surveillance report that is prepared by Ed Kim and the CSSS data team. The complaints and potential safety issues are discussed, and emerging safety issues are triaged. And then after the committee receives cross-disciplinary expert input, a decision is made on the investigation needed and the path forward for these issues. Okay, so now I'm going to share with you some real-life examples of safety issues that were identified by the CSSS safety process and how they were resolved. So the first one is lack of adhesion with a transdermal product. This was a recently approved generic transdermal system indicated to treat hypertension. We received about 30 reports of inadequate adhesion, and many of those were associated with lack of efficacy. An FDA investigation was done, and it revealed manufacturing problems related to the adhesive layer of the patches. These findings were conveyed to the applicant, and they voluntarily initiated a market withdrawal of the product. The next example involved a serious safety issue related to a generic formulation. The product was lansoprazole orally disintegrating tablet, and one of the labeled uses included the potential for administration through feeding tubes. So we began to receive reports that this specific generic product was clogging feeding tubes and requiring surgical replacement in some patients. We launched an investigation which included an analysis by our FDA laboratory. That analysis revealed that this particular generic formulation had a different product performance compared to the brand name product. An FDA drug safety alert was posted on our website, and the applicant voluntarily withdrew the product from the market. So because of this investigation, orally disintegrating tablet products that are indicated for use with a feeding tube are now tested for this functionality using a protocol that we developed in the Office of Generic Drugs. This last example involved dropper issues with an ophthalmic solution product. The product was a generic ophthalmic solution indicated to treat elevated intraocular pressure. We received multiple MedWatch reports of eye burning and irritation, large and uncontrollable drop size, and patients were complaining they were just running out of the product too soon. Again, our FDA lab tested the product, and it showed that this particular generic product had a larger drop size than the brand or other generics. At OGD's request, the applicant revised their container closure system to resolve the issue. Okay, so now I want to move away from the simpler products and talk about complex generic drug combination products. As I mentioned in the beginning, drug products are getting more complex and they have unique quality and reliability issues. For example, there may be problems with transdermal patches not sticking, or patients may complain that their patches are just too big. We also have situations where a drug and device are packaged together, and there may be a difference between the generic and brand products. For example, a pre-filled syringe kit may include a different needle presentation. The photos on the right show two different needle presentations that are actually for the same drug product. One is the brand's needle, and the other is the generic's. This may cause some confusion when a patient is switched from one product to the next. And sometimes it is the device that causes the safety problem in a combination product. When that happens, we will collaborate with the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, in evaluating the issue. Here's an example where a device can create some unintended consequences with a drug product. We have a drug product that is approved in a pre-filled syringe under a new drug application and/or abbreviated new drug applications. Then we also have general use auto-injector devices that are approved separately as 510Ks. Companies may sometimes promote the use of the auto-injector with the pre-filled syringe to the target patient population. The consequence is that the brand and generic drug products and their auto-injectors may not be interchangeable, and that may cause use errors. A potential safety issue can arise when a first generic is introduced into the market where there was only one brand product and one auto-injector. A good example of this is with Glatiramer acetate injection auto-injector devices. The brand product is a pre-filled syringe for multiple sclerosis, and it was approved in 1996. We have two generics, one by Sandoz, approved in 2015, and one by Mylan, approved in 2017. The Center for Devices and Radiological Health approved 3 general use auto-injector devices as 510Ks, and these are marketed independently by each manufacturer on their websites. So we have 3 different pre-filled syringes and 3 different auto-injectors, as you see at the top of the slide, the different photos of them. And we have become aware that medical errors related to bent needles and injector failures have been reported in fairs since the generics were approved. And this is something we're looking at, and we're trying to help the patient population. So the emerging trend in generic drug surveillance is to be more proactive instead of reacting to potential safety issues, especially with these complex products. We know that generic drugs are as safe and effective as the brand drugs. Complex drug-device combination products raise unique issues due to concerns related to drug delivery, differences in device constituents, and potential for confusion at the patient-user interface. So the CSSS is looking at generic drugs and their differences, and we are trying to anticipate problems. We want to think about these potential drug safety issues as early as possible in the ANDA development process. And we're looking into the use of exploratory analyses that may help us early detect generic drug complaints or medication use errors at the patient-user interface. So my final slide here is just some helpful advice. It's important to ensure the consistent quality of your products throughout their shelf life. Anticipate and avoid product differences that may impact patient perception and their ability to use the product as intended. Attend public meetings regarding safety or other issues relevant to generics as well as brand products, and actively work to promote confidence in generic drugs. So now on to the challenge questions. The first question is, which one of these is an allowable difference between the generic and the brand product? A, shape, B, container closure system, C, inactive ingredients, D, packaging, E, all of the above. Well, if you chose E, you're exactly right. All of these are allowable differences between the generic and the brand product. Challenge question number 2. Which of the following statements about the CSSS Safety and Surveillance Committee is not true? Is it A, results of CSSS Pharmacovigilance Activity Report are presented and evaluated by the group? B, only includes members from the Office of Generic Drugs? C, decides on investigations and a path forward? D, discusses and triages emerging safety surveillance issues forwarded by the CSSS? The answer is B. The committee doesn't just include members from the Office of Generic Drugs. We also have members from the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality and other CDER offices as needed. It just depends on what issue we're discussing. And that concludes my presentation, and now I open it up for questions. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Debbie. That was great. Actually, thanks to all three of our speakers. We are going to get ready for Q&A here. So folks that are online, if you have not already shared the questions you had for any of the three speakers, please go ahead and type those into the Q&A pod in the lower right-hand corner. And we will be digging through those as quickly as we can to pick out some and read them. With that, hopefully all three of we're doing a bit of gymnastics now, as you might get. Hopefully Linda, Edward, and Deborah have all called into the phone bridge there with the number that I shared, and we're ready to go. And I'm going to unmute Lisa. And Lisa, do we have our first question that we can share with the panel?
Hi, Jeff. Yes, we do. Our first question is for Dr. Forsyth. Are you ready, Dr. Forsyth?
Yes, yes.
Okay, wonderful. So the questioner wants to know, do sponsors who conduct bioequivalence studies in foreign countries need to submit serious adverse event reports for studies that support U.S. ANDAs?
Well, thank you very much for that question. So the question was do sponsors who conduct bioequivalence studies need to submit SAEs if the studies are conducted outside the United States? So the answer is no. Sponsors that conduct studies overseas do not need to submit SAEs to the FDA. They can, but they don't have to. There'll be a little more information about that in the guidance for industry that can be found, that was also included on the slides, for safety reporting requirements for IND and bioequivalence studies. And that's actually, we'll talk a little more about that, but they're not required to.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Forsyth. Our next question is for Edward Kim. So you're on, Edward?
Hi there.
Hi, Edward. Okay, great. So the questioner wants to know, can you please share which website or link is the correct website to perform literature research?
Hi, yes, thanks for the question. I'm not sure who asked it, but CSSS uses a variety of websites and resources to access published medical literature. Universally, I think folks use PubMed, but I want to refer you to the guidances that are available throughout FDA. And there's a very useful search function there. The website is fda.gov/regulatory information. That's fda.gov/regulatory, regulatory -information, INFORMATION. And there you can access a portal where you can search for FDA guidances specifically related to best practices for good pharmacovigilance practices and pharmacoepidemiologic assessments. And there are even more specific resources there, guidances for good industry practices, for pharmacovigilance practices, and pharmacoepidemiologic assessment. I would lean towards using those guidances to guide any kind of literature searches that you'd like to conduct. And again, there are multi-page guidances that contain a wealth of information that you can leverage. If you need more information about that, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I hope that's helpful, and thanks again for your question.
Great, thank you. We actually have another follow-up question for you on your presentation. So you had the data shown in slides 7 to 8. Is this data available to the public to download and analyze on their own?
Thanks for the question. I am trying to remember what I said in slides 7 and 8, but hold on 1 second. Yes, okay. So, yes, the short answer is we have displayed some of this information to the public already. Most of the slides that I presented for simplicity had been sort of simplified so that it can illustrate a concept. And you probably won't find some of the information, particularly in slide 8, where there's a comparison between complaint cases and market share. So I've done that, and the team has put together those trends, not based on specific information, but hypothetical information, just to show how we compare complaints with market share and other real-world data sources. So that probably won't be viewable, nor I don't think anyone would be very interested in seeing that data. But the complaint trends for DQRS data, they have been. Thanks for your question.
All right, thank you, Edward. So our next question is for Deborah. Has the Office of Generic Drugs ever removed any generic products from the market based on MedWatch reports?
This is Deborah. Thank you for the question. I don't believe we have. We have taken an action on a product in which we lowered the therapeutic equivalence code in the Orange Book, and it was no longer AB rated. So that's a situation where we had conducted an investigation based on complaints, MedWatch complaints in fairs. It became evident that the product was not bioequivalent, it was not therapeutically equivalent to the brand. And so we downgraded that generic in the Orange Book. But to my knowledge, we haven't removed anything off the market. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. That's great. Okay. Our next question is also for Deborah. Do you have a minimum number of complaints as a requirement before you will do an investigation into a product?
Well, we have, in Ed Kim's group, the data team, we have metrics of surveillance that we're looking at numbers of complaints, and we do have certain criteria that we look at, but we don't just consider numbers. I guess the easy answer is it depends on the product. Sometimes complaints are so compelling that we immediately gets our attention. And the perfect example of that is the one that I shared with the lansoprazole orally disintegrating tablet product. This generic had recently, it was only on the market like 3 months, and we had only gotten 5 complaints initially, 5 MedWatch complaints, which wouldn't necessarily get your attention if it's just 5. However, those 5 complaints, all of the folks had to go to the emergency room and have their feeding tube surgically replaced because this generic was clogging the feeding tube. And that really got our attention because of the severity of it. And we said, we need to really take a look at this quickly and jump on it. So I think it's not an easy answer to say there's a definitive number where we want to, okay, we're going to investigate this or we're not based on a, hard number. We're really looking at the narratives in the MedWatch complaints, and we're looking at the severity of the adverse event. Were folks hospitalized? What happened? So we're really carefully investigating these complaints, and we take the seriousness of these. We're very committed to thoroughly reviewing them, and we will jump on things if we see a concern. So it's just not a hard number that I can give you.
Okay, thank you so much, Deborah. We have another question for Ed, and the question, I'm not sure exactly how it was written, but hopefully this will be clear. So the questioner wants to know how adverse events reporting differs between generic and brand drugs, and what systems are in place to ensure that FDA is collecting the most accurate information for both, so they make a good decision.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and if I could just say it again and just paraphrase so folks can sort of get it clearer, is that is there a difference between a complaint that is put forward for a generic product versus a complaint that's put forward in a brand product? And oftentimes when a complaint comes in and we review it, it's hard to distinguish whether or not the complaint is specifically geared towards a generic or a brand product. It really depends on the quality of the narrative, the entry, complete fields that were put in, and often it's hard to make that distinction. So that's something that we wanted to stress, or I wanted to stress in the presentation, that the quality of the reports that are put forward are critical. It's not just the quantity of the reports, it's also the quality. So with increased quality, that would be most beneficial for the whole big picture of looking at MedWatch forms. Thanks for your question.
Great, thank you, Edward. Our last question today is for Deborah. Does FDA have a drug recall process for generics if something is going wrong with the product?
So do we have a drug recall process? Is that what you mentioned?
Correct. Will FDA recall, will FDA recall a generic drug product?
The answer to that is that, believe it or not, FDA does not have the authority to recall any drug product. That includes brand name products. We have the authority to recall food products, but we, surprisingly, to me at least, we don't have the authority to recall drug products. So how do drug products get off the market? What happens is when we launch an investigation, and if we find a problem, and this would go for brand name products as well as generics, if we determine that there is a safety issue that is, would warrant that a product is recalled, we contact the sponsor and we share the safety issue with them, and we, strongly encourage them to remove the product from the market or do, some sort of voluntary market recall. And what we have found is companies, heartily agree, because they certainly don't want their product, out on the market if it has some sort of potential safety issue with it. So in my experience, companies have been very good about agreeing with us and taking action quickly.
Okay, and as Lisa mentioned, thank you much, Deborah, Edward, Linda. Great job joining on the bridge to answer the Q&A. And that does wrap